In the late 1990s, space combat simulators were riding high until they suddenly weren't. The genre's golden age peaked with Free Space 2. Often hailed as one of the greatest space sims ever made, and I fully agree with that. I was there at the time. I was 23 years old when that game came out. Yet unfortunately, Free Space 2's commercial performance was absolutely dismal. It sold only around about 27,000 copies in the US by the end of 1999, and this, quite understandably, was a shockingly low figure for such a high-profile game. And people at the time widely recognised that this might inadvertently spell out the death of the space sim genre forever. That turned out to be a shockingly accurate prediction. Major publishers, seeing such meagre returns, quickly lost interest in funding new big-budget space games. What followed was essentially a space game drought in the early 2000s. Throughout the mid-2000s, very few notable spaceflight titles emerged, aside from 2003's Freelancer, which had of course its own problems and eventually become somewhat of a cult classic. And we also had the niche X series by Egosoft, and not forgetting EVE Online. It was these titles that held the torch for the genre for more than a decade, as, well, unfortunately AAA space games all but vanished from store shelves. The Metacritic rolls from about 2005 to 2011 list only a handful of space-themed games, and almost none were big-budget mainstream releases, a stark contrast to the early 90s when the new Wing Commander and X-Wing titles were routine. Space games in this era largely survived in the indie and strategy niches, leaving fans of cockpit-style space games longing for the genre's revival. And yes, that was to come, but ultimately it perhaps didn't play out as many people hoped. The genre's fortunes began to turn in the mid-2010s, fittingly fueled by the passion and the wallets of fans themselves. Crowdfunding breathed new life into space games, and in late 2012, industry veteran Chris Roberts launched a Kickstarter for Star Citizen. Pitching a grand return to Wing Commander-style space epics, the response was overwhelming. The Star Citizen Kickstarter raised over $2.1 million in just 1 month. And that was just the beginning. Roberts simultaneously ran a campaign with his own website, and by November of 2012, the combined crowdfunding tally reached a record $6 million. This unprecedented success, there was nothing else like it at the time, proved there was a pent-up demand for space games, space genre, and space sims, and what started as a fan-funded dream completely snowballed over the subsequent decade. Star Citizen kept raising money through the pledged ships and subscription, and as of now, as of April 2025, Star Citizen's total crowdfunding has surpassed $800 million. And yes, even as the game remains in alpha. Around the same time, British developer David Braben turned to Kickstarter to finally create a sequel to Elite. Braben's Elite Dangerous campaign launched in November 2012 with a hefty goal of £1.25 million. Skeptics wondered if nostalgia alone could drive such a funding, but ultimately it could. The Kickstarter closed in January 2013 with £1.5 million pledged. That's around about $2.4 million at the time. By April 2014, public funding for Elite Dangerous had reached roughly £1.7 million, thanks to Frontier ongoing pre-order sales from its own website. By the time the game launched in late 2014, it seems that total crowdfunding plus pre-orders had grown to over £6 million. Now, it's hard to find the official documentation of that. There is a forum link here where this was originally documented, but the official financial websites that forum thread links to are now no longer functional. At any rate, there was significant money being pumped into this game, and in Braben's own words, this fan funding really did test the concept and proved investors wrong about gamers' interest in open-world space games. The successful releases then of these titles marked the return of AAA space games. Elite Dangerous hit PC in December 2014 with console releases a little bit later on, and it delivered on a promise of a vast open-world Milky Way galaxy. It was well received and continued to grow, selling over 2.1 million units by the end of 2016. Star Citizen, whilst still not officially released here in 2025, has rolled out playable alpha modules and attracted hundreds of thousands of backers. Together, regardless of what you may or may not feel about them, these projects signalled that the long space sim drought was ending. If any game tested whether space games could truly go mainstream again, it was No Man's Sky. A small indie studio going by the name of Hello Games managed to generate enormous hype pre-launch, with promises of a practically infinite procedurally generated universe. When No Man's Sky launched in August 2016, initial player engagement was through the stratosphere. On PC alone, the game saw over 200,000 concurrent players on Steam. And across PC and PlayStation 4, the numbers were obviously much higher, and these were far, far beyond what the developers expected. This made No Man's Sky one of 2016's biggest launches by player count and proved the mass appeal of space exploration. However, the launch was also infamous, not only for its backlash, but also the missing features and mismatched expectations, which led to fan outrage. And within weeks, the shiny new universe started looking empty. By late August 2016, just a few weeks post-release, Steam concurrent players had plummeted to around 20,000, a 90% drop from its peak, and the numbers only continued to drop from there. And yes, whilst post-launch player drop-off is normal, No Man's Sky collapse was unusually severe. Fueled by negative reviews and refund requests, the phrase "too good to be true" seemed completely apt. The game that promised everything delivered very little, and its reputation tanked. Yet this is a story of redemption. Rather than abandon the game, as many other developers may have done, Hello Games spent the next several years updating No Man's Sky relentlessly, and all of this for free. Major updates gradually added and improved base building, true multiplayer, VR support, story missions, and countless quality of life improvements. The once barren universe became rich with content, and crucially, the studio's silence and then sudden shadow drops of updates really gave way to goodwill. By 2018, No Man's Sky was winning Best Ongoing Game Awards for its dramatic turnaround. And fast forward to the mid-2020s, No Man's Sky is held up as the textbook example of a comeback. Each new update still draws players back in droves. For instance, a mid-2024 content update known as the Worlds Update sent No Man's Sky Steam population soaring all the way to very close to 50,000 concurrent players, the highest it had been since 2019. And in 2025, the game remains very much alive, often with several thousand players concurrently online. The launch might have nearly killed it, but the decade's later half saved No Man's Sky. It's a redemption arc that parallels the resurgence of the space genre itself. Hello Games were not the only smaller studio to find success with the space sim renaissance. Other independent studios also proved the genre's viability with some creative twists. Two notable indie studios really stood out in 2015 and 2017, Rebel Galaxy and Everspace. These achieved solid successes both in sales and reception, showing that smaller titles could fill the void and build their own fan bases. Rebel Galaxy came out in 2015 and took a different approach from hardcore cockpit sims, opting for Firefly meets Pirates, capital ship combat on a 2D plane. This was developed by a two-man studio known as Double Damage Games. Rebel Galaxy flew under the radar until it suddenly didn't. Upon release, it surprised everyone by selling over 75,000 copies on Steam's first week. This was an impressive number for an indie space game with relatively little marketing. Critics too were pleasantly surprised. Rebel Galaxy earned generally favourable reviews, with IGN praising its mix of open-world freedom and a swashbuckling vibe. And for a genre supposedly dead, Rebel Galaxy's strong debut in 2015 was a clear sign that gamers still hungered for cruising at the stars, even if it took an indie outfit to deliver. Double Damage later followed up with another game, Rebel Galaxy Outlaw, in 2019, and this prequel focused on fighter piloting and was more of a traditional space sim, and yeah, this one was a great game too. Now, on the other end of the spectrum was Everspace. This came out in 2017. This was a roguelike space combat shooter that blended arcade action with procedurally generated runs. The game went into Kickstarter in 2015, entered early access in 2016, and by the time Everspace fully released in May 2017, it had built up a considerable amount of momentum. Though not traditionally a Wing Commander style sim, its fast-paced gameplay and slick Unreal Engine graphics really did appeal to a lot of fans. Everspace reviewed well, and it translated those reviews into sales. During its early access period alone, Everspace sold 65,000 copies on Steam, generating $1.7 million in revenue according to GameIndustry.biz, enough to fully fund development. Eventually we saw a sequel in the form of Everspace 2, and this moved away from the roguelike form of Everspace 1 and went to a more open world space sim. The success of these indie projects then during 2015 to 2020 is, these aren't the only games, there was many other examples. They showed there was a huge amount of demand for space sims, and there was plenty of money there to be made as well. Space games should then be heading in a bright and bold new direction. Audience interest was there and all but guaranteed. The technology existed to make big, bright and bold games. But more importantly, at least as far as studios were concerned, there was guaranteed money in this as long as it could be pulled off, and that's where things finally started to trip up. The return then of the blockbusters, the return of the big AAA space games coming from big studios. The period 2015 to 2025 culminated in something many PC gamers had long given up on, a brand new AAA single-player space RPG from a top-tier studio. Bethesda Game Studios of Elder Scrolls and Fallout fame delivered Starfield in 2023, arguably the first original big-budget space adventure in years. The anticipation, of course, was immense, understandably so, and Starfield's launch proved that the mainstream audience will show up for space games if the package is appealing enough. By some counts, Starfield was a success. The debut was record-breaking, and on release day, it's claimed that Starfield amassed over 1 million concurrent players across PC and Xbox platforms. This, quite naturally, is an incredible feat for primarily a single-player RPG. And within its first couple of days, Bethesda proudly announced that Starfield had surpassed 6 million players, officially making it the biggest Bethesda game launch of all time. And just over a week later, the momentum appeared to continue. By mid-September, Starfield's total player count, as Bethesda claimed, had blasted past 10 million. Notably, Starfield achieved these numbers despite being exclusive to PC and Xbox. There was no PlayStation release. Game Pass, of course, undoubtedly helped to drive the player count upwards, lowering the barrier of entry for PC and Xbox users. However, even on Steam, Starfield was a powerhouse of numbers. It saw around 250,000 concurrent players on Steam at the daily peak around the launch week, and this implies hundreds of thousands of PC copies sold in a very short time, even just on Steam. But the numbers don't paint the full picture, and today we're at a very low player count for this game, at least according to Steam, and arguably this is one of the lower played Bethesda games. What went wrong? Well, the game was plagued by technical problems, many design issues as well for the game just fundamentally didn't hit with the player, they just didn't click. Despite Bethesda having a strong history of high-quality RPGs, Starfield just didn't hit with the traditional Bethesda audience, at least a significant portion of it. And despite today that many people still do play the game, it's nowhere near as successful as many other Bethesda titles. And then we come to the space game section itself, which many people felt as though it was tacked on. Sure, you could fly a spaceship, but it seemed that you could only fly these in somewhat self-contained areas. And in a genre where flying a spaceship meant literally flying everywhere through millions of light years across dozens of star systems, even trillions of star systems in some cases, this really did feel like a massive limitation for Starfield. What should have been a massive success story then for AAA space games turned out to be more of a miss than a hit. The second opportunity emerged to really claim back the AAA space game space with perhaps one of the most recognizable sci-fi franchises of all time, Star Wars. Star Wars Outlaws then, released in August of 2024. It gave players a massive, fully open-world adventure with the ability to get into spaceships, leave the atmosphere, fly in space, head to another planet and land there. This was another huge big-budget title from a massive studio, Ubisoft themselves. The game did generate a lot of interest, but unfortunately, according to Ubisoft themselves, it underperformed. It was also far from a hit with the fans that it could have been, that it should have been. Yet, despite not making it quite as big as was expected and anticipated back in 2024, some people feel that it's still early days and there's room for a comeback story here. After all, it wouldn't be the only comeback story within the genre. On the 17th of April, Ubisoft announced a free 3-hour demo of Star Wars Outlaws. This is available across all platforms. Additionally, a second DLC update is coming called A Pirate's Fortune. This is a new story mode for the game, adding a significant bunch of extra gameplay. Following on from this, we can expect to see Star Wars Outlaws on the upcoming Switch 2. This will tap into a large new audience. So just maybe all isn't lost for Star Wars, and somewhere out there is a new hope. But it turns out that a new hope was not to be big publishers. Bethesda and Ubisoft were not the only big publishers to enter the market. We also saw 2K Games deliver not one, but two space game failures. These were each published by different arms of 2K Games, starting with Homeworld 3. This came from Gearbox Publishing and Blackbird Interactive. Finally then, everyone was very excited to see a sequel for the highly respected Homeworld franchise. However, Homeworld 3's release really did illustrate that not every revival leads to runaway success. The game met mixed critical reception and poor player numbers, raising doubts about the appetite for RTS-style space games in the AAA sphere. However, I'd argue that it's nothing to do with the RTS space games themselves, but rather how they're implemented. First, the basics. Homeworld 3 released in May of 2024 for PC, and expectations were high among RTS fans. Critically, the game earned decent, if not outstanding reviews, and holds a 75 out of 100 Metacritic score, solidly in the green, but lower than its predecessors. Reviewers also praised what was the core tactical gameplay of fleet combat in a fully 3D space. However, some pointed out that Homeworld 3's campaign story was lackluster. In some, it was seen as a respectable, if unambitious sequel that perhaps skewed too closely to the formula of the older games. The more troubling news for Homeworld 3 came in its market performance. On Steam, the game struggled right out of the gate. Its all-time peak concurrent players was only around 4,000 players. This was shortly after launch, very low numbers for a hyped sequel. Within a week, active player counts dropped to the mere hundreds, suggesting sale figures were limited to hardcore fanbase only. By the end of its launch week, it was widely assumed that Homeworld 3 was a commercial failure. Player reception was also sharply divided. Steam users' reviews turned mostly negative, around about 38% positive by late 2024. Today, recent reviews sit at 47%, which gives it a score of mixed. Player numbers, meanwhile, are ridiculously low, with Steam's charts showing average players of around about 60. Yes, double-digit numbers. Long-time Homeworld fans expressed their disappointment about missing features and a sense that the game didn't evolve enough, while new players found the experience unforgiving. Blackbird Interactive did issue post-launch patches, but within 6 months they announced they would be ending active development on the title. For the space genre then, Homeworld 3's case is a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's great to see a classic series revived at all, a testament to the decade's trend of dusting off old space game IPs. On the other hand, its poor commercial reception suggests that not every space subgenre has a wide appeal now enjoyed by many space games or space RPGs. For many then, the question might be whether space game RTS don't really have a trouble when it comes to an audience. Are they a little bit too niche? Or perhaps whether Homeworld 3 itself had some more fundamental, foundational issues about its game. Homeworld 3 unfortunately wasn't the only space game from 2K Games to suffer catastrophic failure. One of the most anticipated sequels in the space gaming community was Kerbal Space Program 2, which entered early access in February of 2023. The original Kerbal Space Program, launched in 2011, was an indie darling that let players build rockets and explore a miniature solar system. Blending realistic physics with little green Kerbals, there was a load of humour here as well as scientific accuracy. Hopes were high then that KSP2 would expand on that foundation with new technology and interstellar travel. Instead, Kerbal Space Program 2's early access launch became a lesson in how not to launch a sequel. It was met with significant player disappointment due to technical issues and missing features. Upon its early access release in February of 2023, KSP2 garnered very mixed feedback. By that week's end, Steam user reviews were sitting at only 50% positive. Many long-term Kerbal fans posted lengthy critiques, the number one complaint was terrible performance. Even high-end gaming PCs were struggling to run KSP 2 at a decent frame rate, with reports of single-digit FPS and frequent stutters or crashes throughout the game. Perhaps more damning was the sense that KSP 2 was content incomplete. The game launched in sandbox mode, with only sandbox mode, and lacked the organised progression or adventure that some expected. Features that KSP 1 had years ago were absent, things as vital as science gathering. Now, the developers at Intercept Games acknowledged these issues and laid out a roadmap to improve performance and add features over time. Over the course of 2023 and into 2024, they did indeed release multiple patches that addressed certain bugs. However, disaster struck, and then in 2024 rumours persisted that, Kerbal Space Program 2 was not only shutting down, but that also the developers had been shuttered and sold on. That rumour persisted for many months with no official confirmation, until eventually, many months later, confirmation was received. The franchise is now in the hands of a brand new owner, and there's no real news as to what that means for Kerbal Space Program 2. Despite that, it's still actively on sale on Steam, hasn't received any updates for a very long time, and has perhaps one of the lowest scores across any game on Steam, with an overwhelmingly negative recent review score of just 16%. The years between 2015 then and 2025 really do highlight that there is a massive audience and huge interest in the space game genre. But equally, it highlights there was a lot of successes and a lot of failures. That said, I absolutely haven't mentioned every single game that was available in the space game genre between that time period. There are a few more I can quickly touch on, but of course there's far too many to recount. Some really great games: Outer Wilds, Star Wars Squadrons, Everspace 2, Hard Space Shipbreaker, a great one in the form of X4 Foundations, Rebel Galaxy Outlaw, Chorus, Avorion, and many more. From 2015 to 2025 then, the space game genre underwent a dramatic resurgence. Before 2012, one would be hard-pressed to find a single high-profile space sim in development. By 2025, we've seen multiple AAA space adventures, countless indies, and even the revival of dormant franchises. Crowdfunding played a pivotal role in kickstarting this renaissance, as did the determination of developers to stick with projects for the long haul. We've seen hallowed games to great effect there. The decade delivered some unequivocal triumphs, with No Man's Sky and Elite sustaining thriving communities. Starfield really did bring the genre to the mainstream, although ultimately not quite in the way everyone hoped. And indies like Everspace continued to turn healthy profits. At the same time, the era also taught some hard lessons for the genre. Not every comeback attempt will succeed. Nostalgia alone doesn't guarantee huge sales, as we saw with Homeworld 3. A passionate fanbase can be fickle if expectations aren't met and the developers just don't deliver, as we saw with KSP 2. And even a high-profile franchise recognition, such as Star Wars, doesn't guarantee success. So, did this decade truly save the AAA space games? In many ways, yes. It's no exaggeration to say space games are more alive now than they've been in the last 2 or 3 decades. By 2025, multiple big publishers are investing in the genre again, and the indie scene is vibrant. The drought of 2005 to 2011 is a distant memory. We have a variety, from hardcore simulations to arcade shooters, from single-player epics to shared world experiences, a richness of choice that fans in the early 2000s could only dream of. However, the second part of this video's title, Or Did It?, implies there's room for debate. The caution comes from observing the success that often required massive effort, community goodwill, and long-term support to truly pay off. The genre's revival is not a simple on-off switch, but an ongoing process. If the majority of the releases of this decade had all flopped, it could have easily swung the other way. Instead, enough hits occurred to rejuvenate interest, but also a few high-profile stumbles and money sinks that publishers will surely take note of. As we move beyond 2025, the onus is on developers to continue this positive trend by learning from both the hits and the misses of the last 10 years. If they do, the future of space games will remain bright. This decade didn't magically save space games, people did. Passionate developers and fans together proved the genre's worth, and as long as that remains true, space games will never again be consigned to the void.